Welcome to the HC Commodities podcast, a podcast dedicated to the commodities sector and the people within it. I'm your host, Paul Chapman. This podcast is produced by HC Group, a global search firm dedicated to the commodities sector. Today we're talking about the growing role of batteries in the power markets. Over the last 5 years, the utility-scale batteries have proliferated across the US to an astonishing degree. Who owns those batteries? Who operates them? Why do they exist? And how are they changing the power markets themselves? Our guest is Casey Keller. Casey is Head of Assets and Development at Caerus Commodities, which is a proprietary trading firm alongside an asset management and development business focused on US energy. As always, you could really support the show by leaving us a positive review on the platform you're listening on, particularly a written review on Apple or Spotify. And as always, I hope you enjoyed the episode. Casey, welcome to the show.
Thanks, Paul. Happy to be here.
So we've got a fascinating story. In one part, the significant growth and relevancy of battery storage to the power grid, the power market, in talking, I guess, US-centric here, but this is a story that applies across Europe as well. And then exactly how those batteries are fitting into the market itself, how they're being optimized, and the opportunity around that. But can you, I guess, get us all on the same page? What do we mean by batteries in this sense? Where are they placed? How do they function? What sort of terminology should we be using?
Yeah, absolutely. It's to your point, a very wide-reaching word and industry. So I think for this conversation, we can focus primarily on just sort of the center of the fairway. Basically, there's two types of battery systems: behind the meter and front of the meter. Behind the meter tend to be installed on sort of the commercial or industrial user's premise. They're a bit smaller as a general rule than front of the meter, and their purpose is really to help the commercial or industrial user improve the stability or cut costs via managing for CP, sort of their peak demand. But if the local framework allows for it, they can also supply some amount of energy back onto the grid as an additional revenue stream. We're not really going to focus on those because they are smaller. They're not as able to be dispatched. So what we're focusing on is what's called front of the meter. Those are larger and sort of directly connected to the power grid, and they are used more to make money for the owner of the battery, which has, for the most part, with the exception of utilities, no other goal other than to buy low and sell high. So that's kind of the two different types of batteries. There's a lot of different battery chemistries and durations. We're going to be focusing on lithium ion, which is the most commercialized at this point in time, the most bankable, the ones with the most history and data, and also the ones that are, I don't want to say the cheapest, but the ones that are the most economic in terms of the revenue sources that are available to them versus the capital costs that it takes to purchase and install them. So these batteries work by sort of, and I'm not a chemist or anything remotely related to that, but they move lithium ions between positive and negative electrodes through an electrolyte. And they're very similar to batteries that are used in electric cars and mobile phones. So again, sort of the most widely implemented in the world at this point in time.
Yeah, and we've got plenty of episodes in the back catalogue on the different battery chemistries and so forth if people are interested.
Perfect.
Can you just give us some sense of scale here in the sense of how big are these batteries? And then this has been, and it kind of astonished me when we first started talking, the growth in the prevalence of these batteries across the grid.
Yeah. It is sort of a staggering story on the growth side, but starting with the first part of your question, from a size perspective, usually front of the meter systems are delineated into DG, which is distributed generation, which are smaller. And those, depending on the ISO, range generally from 0 to 10 megawatts. Sometimes it's up to 50 megawatts, but it's sort of that smaller category. And then the utility scale batteries can be as large as anyone wants. But, the largest that we've really seen is around 500 megawatts. I think I've seen them in the queues for up to 1,000 megawatts, but those aren't commercial yet. You do reach, depending on the power flow dynamics of your specific node, you can reach a point where the battery is sort of cannibalizing the volatility that it's been built to chase. So size becomes sort of a point of diminishing returns where bigger is not always better. Yeah, as far as sort of the growth of batteries, it is truly a wild story. I first got involved in batteries, 2018, I think it was. And at that point in time, batteries were sort of something that everybody was talking about and nobody was doing. And you'd tell people that you were working on developing batteries, and their eyes would kind of glaze over. Oh, that's really cool. But nobody was interested in doing any deals around it. There really were not any on the grid at that point in time. Fast forward, what has it been, 6 years? And all you hear about is batteries. All you see in the queues is batteries. I think in CAISO alone, there's a little over 10 gigawatts of batteries that have been installed. And, you want to talk about exponential growth. Over 6,000 of those megawatts were installed in 2024. So this is something that's really just taken off in the past couple of years. ERCOT is a very similar story. I think at the beginning of this year, they were just over 3 gigawatts, and they're forecasted to be sitting at over 12 gigawatts by the end of 2024, and then, 18 gigawatts by the end of 2025. But what's really wild is if you look at the number of batteries in the queue in almost any ISO, and those numbers are just mind-boggling. So I was looking at ERCOT's a couple months ago, and there were 150 gigawatts of batteries in the queue. Obviously, the vast majority of those don't get built, but still, just the amount of time and effort that is being spent looking at batteries, developing batteries, trying to get these projects commercialized. And those completion rates vary based on the ISO, of course. But yeah, this is something that worldwide is going to be sort of, already is, but will continue to be the next big asset class that just continues to experience this exponential growth year over year.
Yeah, well, and CAISO, California, ERCOT, Texas, ISO, sort of the regional operator. Can you just give us some sense of, that 10 gigawatts currently installed in, say, CAISO? What does that reflect, or what percentage of that is against the base load that you see on a typical day in California?
Yeah, absolutely. So basically, if you look at ERCOT, for example, you're looking at a system that has 70 gigawatts of load on a hot summer day. And so batteries are already going to be, a seventh of that. And that percentage will be expected to grow. CAISO is a little bit smaller, but sort of similar types of percentages. And the influences that cause more batteries to be developed in any specific grid vary. There's obviously the economic incentive of just how much money you can make off of energy arbitrage, ancillary services. But then in some locations, there's also, overarching policy goals like, 10, 12 states have specific energy storage targets where, Maryland has to deploy 3 gigawatts of energy storage by the end of 2033, things like that. And some of those states get more specific into those procurement targets, like California has a storage goal, but then pumped storage can only be X percent of that. So the rest has to be battery storage.
Yeah.
So it depends on a number of different things. I think the way we've seen the growth play out in the US so far is, as with a lot of policy decisions, California has been a first mover. We've seen the battery boom there, been living it for a couple years. ERCOT was a little bit later to the party, but definitely has made up for lost time. And then we're starting to see similar types of growth across the rest of the US ISOs, SPP, MISO, PJM, New York ISO, anywhere that you have either these overarching state procurement targets, you have just the proliferation of wind and solar creating this, disparity on the grid of, hey, we predicted this much megawatts to be generated, and a cloud came across the sky, so now solar didn't show up. We need something to jump in and fill that gap. Or, one of the dynamics we see in CAISO a lot is there's so much solar, there's too much generation where prices go negative. We see the same type of price formation in ERCOT, West Texas, South Texas. And what batteries do is they sort of act as a sponge to soak up those excess megawatts and then be able to spit them back out during evening peak. So all of those factors sort of play into where storage gets built and developed.
We're going to layer in who the participants are, and then we're going to move on to actually the mechanics of managing price and risk and who does it around these batteries. But just at a very basic level, you're doing a pitch deck to a private equity group or, whatever, or you're trying to describe it to a recruiter. I buy a battery and I stick it in one of these deregulated markets. What are the 2 or 3 ways I can monetize that battery and why?
Yeah. So, primarily people do one of 2 things with their batteries, and these are sort of the bookends. One is they are fully merchant, which means the battery has no forward positions and it's basically floating day to day and trying to maximize its revenue by putting the appropriate amounts of capacity into day ahead energy, real-time energy, and the various ancillary services that it can provide. Batteries are a great asset in the sense that they have almost infinite flexibility. So they can ramp, 1,000 megawatts a second. They can switch from charging to discharging. So they're able to participate in almost every service that an asset can participate in to make money. They can provide regulation. They can provide spin. They can provide non-spin. They can provide energy. So they have a lot of flexibility in terms of how they cash in on that with the market. The other end of the spectrum is if you had a full toll on the battery. So that means the asset owner basically says, we have this asset. We don't want to be subject to that floating revenue that we just talked about. We would rather take what we think is going to be a lower amount of revenue, but it's fixed. And so they basically sell that optimization capability to a trading company or anybody who wants to be on the other end of that deal that says, okay, I will pay you $7 per kW month for that capacity, but you hand me the keys and now I'm going to operate your battery however I want. If I make more than $7 per kW month, I'm going to keep the difference. If I make less than $7 per kW month, I will make up that delta and still make you whole to the $7 per kW month. So obviously, that fully tolled structure is appealing to people who want to have leverage on the asset to enable the debt to come in. Debt almost always needs to see some sort of contracted cash flow. So there are a number of structures in the middle, but those are sort of the 2 ends of the spectrum.
Perfect. And the only one I didn't get there was spin. Quickly, what's that?
Yeah. So basically, ancillary services are the ISO's way of ensuring that at any given point in time, supply meets demand. Obviously, that's easy to do in the day ahead market where they're just guessing what's going to happen. But in real time, you have a number of unknowns that are always happening. Somebody turns their dishwasher on, the wind blows harder than you think it's going to blow. Just, the general variations of people consuming and generating power. A generator trips offline, whatever it is. So in order to be able to deal with those contingencies, the ISOs procure what are called ancillary services. Regulation up and regulation down help them keep the frequency at 60 hertz at any point in time. So those are being deployed constantly every 4 seconds or 2 seconds or whatever it is in very small increments. So, if you're getting deployed for regulation, it's 10 megawatts or 5 megawatts. It's not your full capacity. Spin is sort of the next layer of contingency. So an ISO would call on spin if, for example, a gas generator tripped offline and that gas generator was supposed to be providing 500 megawatts of power. Now it's providing 0. So the ISO can't rely on regulation because those deployments are too small. It needs a large chunk of power that's ready to go, so already spinning, and can be called on to be online within 10 minutes. So that's what spin is. And then non-spin is sort of the next level down where you don't have to be online. You can start up within 30 minutes, but it's an even larger amount of power to deal with contingencies that are sort of the next layer down.
The energy and resources sector is experiencing unprecedented change. To help companies navigate this world and capture its opportunities, HC Group launched Enco Insights in 2023. Enco has rapidly become the leading global expert network dedicated to energy and resources. Enco Insights leverages HC Group's 20 years of connections and dedication to the sector to give clients the expertise they need to take decisions fast. Connect with Enco's experts for anything from a 1-hour insight call to a longer-term consulting project at encoinsights.com.
I find this fascinating because, yeah, like you say, sort of 5 years ago, lots of people were talking about it. And then, overnight, it seems you've just got this incredible amount of capacity that has been built. Who is building it, and who is operating it? And does sometimes is that combined? Just, who are the participants on that side? And then I want to get into the actual mechanics of price risk management. Yeah, but who's building this stuff and who's operating it?
It is fascinating because it does feel like it's happened overnight, even for the people who have been living it. It's just been such a quick transition. And I think with a lot of things in the world, the rate of change is increasing so much. And we've really seen that play out in battery storage, not only in the adoption, but also the price curve. So with any new technology, price comes down over time. And that deceleration of price has been so fast in battery storage, much quicker than it was in solar or in wind. So I think, in general in the world, things are just getting quicker. Or I'm getting older, one of the two. But back to your question, the participants in battery storage are fascinating to me because when I look at energy storage, it's really a trading asset. Right? Like the people who should be owning it are no different than the people who should be owning gas storage or oil storage, because what you're doing is using it to trade power. It's been interesting to see it play out because instead of being a trading asset, it's been lumped into not only the infrastructure asset class, but the renewable infrastructure asset class, where it doesn't really belong. It's not a renewable asset. I'm sure I'll probably get lynched after this recording for saying that, but it's consuming power off the grid. It's agnostic as to where that power comes from. It's certainly not consuming all solar or all wind. And then it's just spitting that power back out after consuming a little bit of it for round trip efficiency. But what we've seen is most of the folks who own energy storage come from the wind and solar space. And they view batteries as just, the next renewable asset. So it's very difficult to find anybody who owns wind and solar who does not now own energy storage. So it's all of those IPPs, all of those private equity backed funds. And because there's been such a glut of cash trying to get into what I broadly call the ESG space, anything tangential to renewables, we've also seen a lot of companies that were operating under sort of a develop and flip model where they'd go out, they would develop wind or solar or battery storage, take the early risk, get the project to what we call NTP, notice to proceed, where they've essentially de-risked it and said, okay, we've taken care of the site control, we've taken care of the interconnection, we've taken care of the permitting. We don't have the capital to build this thing. We're going to go sell it to the NGs of the world and they can build and own it. So there was a whole class of developers who were sort of two guys in a pickup truck, two girls in a pickup truck, where, they were undercapitalized, but really good at what they do. And they were well suited to be taking that early stage risk and then flipping out of these projects for what we call a development fee, their profit. But because all this capital has been trying to get into the space and so many private equity companies were trying to find platforms to back, a lot of those developers turned into, okay, instead of selling those assets at NTP, we're just going to raise capital and build them and own them, which is great, except for the fact that coming back to battery storage is a trading asset. And so now you have all these people holding the keys to batteries who have never dealt with power markets, have never traded power, and basically don't understand how to get the maximum amount of revenue that they can out of this very expensive, very risky asset that they've built.
Let's pick it up there, because the complexity actually involved in trading around a battery is very high, right? Not least, you've got to understand all the regulation, the markets piece as well, but also the technology to, and I assume it gets more complex when you start talking about, real-time optimization versus longer-term optimization and so forth. Can you give us some sense of, roughly speaking, how it's done? And then there's this sort of dichotomy between AI, let's just let the algorithm run it, versus having people do it.
So when I think about how to really optimize storage, I think about it as sort of this Venn diagram. So in one of the circles, you have people who take a pure software approach, and that really falls into sort of what you were describing as AI. So it's people who have set up these machine learning models and whatever type of other price forecast models. They layer into that some optimization that takes into account the physical constraints of the battery, as well as the constraints contained in whatever ISO they're operating in, those market rules. And basically that combined model spits out, okay, here's the optimal decision for the next day. Nobody looks at it. It just automatically happens. And we hope that the AI is doing what it should be doing. The second circle of my Venn diagram is sort of what I call the traditional asset managers. So the folks who have been out there for the past 25 years managing pump storage, managing natural gas fired generation, where they're used to sort of looking at macro movements in a market and making this one decision. Is the gas plant going to run today? Or is my pump storage going to generate today? And I'll come back to sort of the strengths and weaknesses of each of these in a second. The third circle of my Venn diagram is just traders. So people who have not been looking necessarily at asset-backed decisions, but really looking at, trading virtuals. So making a decision between day ahead and real-time prices and which one they think is going to be higher. So if you look at the software solution, and I'll sort of give you a spoiler, which is that I think the answer lies in the center of this Venn diagram, which is the approach that we take. You need all three of these components to really come up with the right answer. So with the software solution, AI and machine learning and algorithms are extremely helpful with storage because the storage asset has to make more decisions than any asset has ever had to make in the history of asset management and power markets. It's so flexible that it can be changing its bids every 5 minutes. And indeed, it has to, because you're also managing state of charge. So, for example, if you decide that the optimal decision for your asset is to take positions that involve, say it's a 100 megawatt battery, you're going to have a regulation up position of 100 megawatts for hour ending 1 through 12, and then you're going to take a charging energy position in hour ending 13 of 100 megawatts, etc. Going through the day, you bid all of these positions in with the hopes of getting awarded. But when you come around to real time, particularly with ancillary services, you're awarded for the capacity, but you don't know how much you're going to be deployed. And that amount depends on how much the grid needs at any given point in time. It depends on how many people turn their lights on. It depends on how strongly the sun is shining. All these factors that can't be predicted. So one day, even though you have the same 100 megawatt regulation position, you might be deployed for 5 megawatts. The next day you're deployed for 50 megawatts. The next day you're not deployed at all. You don't know. And so based on what happens in the previous hour, you have to be adjusting your bids for the next hour. And it gets more granular than that because you can adjust your bids in some markets like ERCOT every 5 minutes. So for a human to be doing that would be extremely difficult. For a human to be doing that alone would be extremely difficult. The problem with a software-only solution is one of the most fascinating things about power markets right now is we're seeing unprecedented price formation. So because all of the wind and solar have come online and more continues to come online every day, now we're adding batteries to that. All of the power flow, all of the generation stack, all of that is changing. When we try and train models, one of the complaints I get from our data scientists more often than anything else is, well, the data is just so sparse because if I use data from 2 years ago, it's not relevant anymore. That's not how the market settles anymore. So machine learning works great when you have massive amounts of data to feed your model for your model to train on.
And when it's not changing itself, right? It's not changing its own rules, right? I think is the problem.
And so, you run into this problem where, as smart as AI is, and I have no doubt that it's smarter than people, but it doesn't understand how things are changing. Whereas if you have a trader who's been through, 5 market shifts before, they can say, hey, I get that this is what's supposed to happen, but oh, guess what? This other, black swan event could happen, and we should really be aware of that.
Just to jump in there, just to understand it, and I know this might sound quite basic, but so you're paid on the capacity that you've committed to help regulate the frequency. And is it simply that the trade-off is, well, if they don't actually use any of that capacity, I'm still getting my $7 a kilowatt month, whatever it was, but actually I could have sold that power in the market for a lot more. It's the opportunity cost I'm missing. Or can you also, in other words, you can't sort of play both sides, if you like.
Exactly. So if you have a 100 megawatt asset, you have 100 megawatts, you can put it into day ahead energy, you can put it into real-time energy, or you can put it into one of the ancillary services. You can't double bid it. So you're making that opportunity cost decision across those products. But to make things more complicated, most batteries have another constraint or two where they're only, quote, allowed. And what I mean by allowed is based on their operations and maintenance contract, their long-term service agreement with their O&M provider, in order to keep the degradation of the battery down to a manageable level, they can only do usually around 1 cycle a day. So a cycle for this 100 megawatt battery would be charging 120 megawatts, discharging 100 megawatts. And that's 1 cycle. So you can't go out and say, okay, I'm just going to charge for 4 hours, discharge for 4 hours, and keep repeating that. So you're trying to walk this line between, okay, I have this limited amount of energy, but I have capacity for every hour of the day. So to your point, when I participate in ancillary services, I'm being paid on my full capacity. I'm not being deployed on my full capacity. Even though ancillary services typically clear less than energy products, you can participate in them for a larger percentage of the day, for a larger amount of megawatt hours across the day, or megawatts since it's capacity. So what you're trying to do is sort of maximize this complex equation with a lot of constraints to figure out what you think will earn you the most revenue.
Right. So there's physical constraints as well, because obviously they don't want to, they want to protect the asset pieces as well.
Exactly. So it's like your phone, right? The more you use it, the more that battery degrades, the more expensive it is to replace those cells that have degraded. So it becomes another cost. You could go out and do 10 cycles a day, but I mean, you'd be paying very dearly for it, and it wouldn't make sense from a market perspective.
Yeah. Okay. So we take so that's the sort of the AI piece, and you've got this complexity of the relevancy of data sets. That data set changes. There's events that happen. Then you sort of take the merchant traders, let's say, or the merchant operators who are working on sort of this, traditional power trading fundamentals and so forth. What are the challenges there when it comes to this technology?
Yeah. So with those guys, they're really good at looking at, okay, what do I think basically the heat rate, market heat rate's going to be today? Does it make sense for my asset to run? Which is a great thing to think about. But as we just talked about, the complexity of a battery is so much greater. And you do need the data science layered into that. You do need something that's going to help you manage your state of charge every 5 minutes across the day as you get deployed or don't get deployed in ancillary services, as your battery ramps up and down to provide energy. you have to constantly sort of adjust and figure out where you want to be spending your energy, spending your capacity. And it's very difficult for, just a human to think about those things. It's difficult to build, a simple model in Excel that looks at where ICE is trading and then come up with the appropriate decision at that granular of a level. So those folks, I think, have had a hard time sort of adjusting to really how many decisions batteries have to make and how complicated and intricate and interdependent those decisions become. So just having that strategy is typically not that successful. The virtuals trader type person sort of experiences a similar problem, because while they're very good at understanding, will day ahead clear higher than real time, that's only one of the decisions that a battery has to make. And like we were just talking about with ancillaries, that's where things get really complicated. That's where the state of charge management comes in. That's where a lot of the infinite changes that you have to make throughout the day come in. So what ends up working the best is really this combination of all three of these things. So you have machine learning and algorithms running in the background that are spitting out suggestions, not the lay of the land or the law, but this might be what you want to do. You have a trader who's familiar with both sort of macro market fundamentals as well as virtuals types decisions, sitting there and saying, okay, this makes sense. Let's go with what the algo says, or this doesn't make sense. I'm going to change this because I understand that when this happens, this might happen. So it's really a confluence of all of those types of thought processes and patterns that lead you to make the most optimal decisions.
And that's where you guys come in, and we'll come back to you at the end. So it's also fair to say as well that many of these owners of these batteries, whether they are private equity or even the renewables companies, they don't have that expertise in-house, right? So ultimately they are going to be outsourcing that battery optimization to another third party, and these are some of the it then stops being their risk, but unless you're doing a revenue share or something, but there's not many skill sets out there that actually teams that combine all those three. That's a relatively rare setup.
It's very rare, and it's been fascinating to me in trying to find clients for our business, because most of these folks, to your point, they've never had to participate in markets. When you own a solar asset, that asset is usually PPA'd, so you're not even exposed to market prices. It's just, when I generate a megawatt hour when the sun shines, I get paid $50, whatever, just flat, right? But also, you can't control solar, so it's going to generate what it's going to generate. You don't really have any decisions to make. But we hear from a lot of folks that they'll say, oh yeah, we bought some software, we're just going to use that. Or, oh, we hired a trader, we're just going to have them do it. And it's sort of a specious solution, because it sounds very simple and it sounds very good, and people think, what's the worst that can happen? We just won't make as much money as we should. What they don't understand is that with any market, right, there's a huge amount of risk. And because people think, well, if I don't have any forward positions, I don't really have any risk on, right? It's just, if I do well, great. If I do less than well, okay, I missed out on a little bit of revenue. But what batteries do is they are taking positions that they may or may not fulfill at later points in the market, right? So if I go out for somebody's battery and I take a day ahead position of 100 megawatts, say they have an outage, they can no longer produce 100 megawatts in real time. That is now a virtual trade. They're buying that 100 megawatts back at whatever the real time price is. So if real time spikes to $1,000 and they had sold it day ahead for $10, they now have a virtual position where they're paying $999. And so it's things like that where I think people don't necessarily realize the risk inherent in, quote, simple, which is not actually simple, asset management. But the problem is also incredibly complex in and of itself. And I understand that it's attractive to think it's sort of imminently solvable and fairly simple to solve it. Because, when Jeremy and I started the business, we actually way underestimated how complex it was and how many people we would need to hire in order to do it right and to do it well. So I definitely understand why people start out thinking that way.
And that's Jeremy Taylor and you, who've
Right.
had years and years running power trading businesses. And
Yeah.
What I sort of find fascinating is kind of, if we can fast forward, and it might be 2 years, it might be 5, it probably isn't 10 given the rate it's going at, but where you have, in the case of ERCOT, you're talking about 150 gigs of storage in the pipeline against an actual daily load of 70. I mean, this is going to even if you have no interest as a trader in batteries or as a business in batteries, you don't want to get into this business. Presumably, though, you can't afford to ignore it, because it's fundamentally going to change how the power market operates, the shape of the power market, the type of volatility and when that volatility occurs, and the financial opportunity that essentially has been there since the start is all now presumably going through quite a dramatic change.
It is. And, there's sort of what I call pro-volatility forces in the market, which are things like, the amount of wind and solar being built. And then you have these anti-vol instruments like batteries that are essentially sucking up all the volatility. And it just depends on which ones get built out at a quicker rate. And it's not one for one, right? You don't need, in a 70 gigawatt peaking market, you don't need 70 gigawatts of batteries. So the point of saturation for batteries happens somewhere long before that, and probably not that far away from where we get to. I think what's going to happen is what happens with almost every asset class, which is, we experience sort of this cyclical overbuild that happens at some point in time. And I think that happens sooner with batteries, because batteries are not a generation asset, right? They are storage, which I know sounds very obvious. But with solar, you could build 70 gigawatts of solar. You could build more than 70 gigawatts of solar in ERCOT and still have that be, quote, useful to the grid. Because energy storage is not a generation asset, we don't need that much of it. What we're really trying to do is sort of have enough storage to satisfy the ancillary markets, which are very shallow by definition in every market. In ERCOT, using that as an example again, ancillary service markets are maximum 5 gigawatts deep. And one of the questions I get a lot is, well, aren't they going to procure more ancillary services as you have more intermittent generation? Yes, but again, it's not one for one. So what's going to happen at some point is we have too much energy storage on the grid, and then what? So then, all the power traders will be very upset because it's killed their volatility. But also all the battery storage owners are going to be upset because the delta between their charging prices and their discharging prices is going to decrease. Their spread will get smaller, which means their revenues get smaller. We've already started to see that price compression in ancillary services. If you were a battery in ERCOT 2 years ago, you would have almost never participated in energy. You would have just sat in ancillary services, very rarely run, and printed cash. Ancillary services today compared to 2 years ago are like a fifth of the price less on a lot of days. And that will continue to decline because supply and demand. So what you're really going to see happen.
So you need that optimization. You do need to participate in these markets because that cash cow is going away.
And you're going to start to see sort of this separation between winners and losers in battery storage optimization. Up until now, it's been pretty good eating for everyone. And so, if you could have earned 20% more, you don't really care because you're still getting a 5-year payback. Things are great. That is going to change. And, payback periods are going to get pushed out. But more importantly, you're going to have assets that become distressed because they're not able to meet debt service. They're not able to meet their equity return thresholds. I think we're going to see a lot of distressed battery storage assets in not that many years from now. And people will start to understand that they need to be optimizing these things as smartly as they can and really squeezing every penny out because there's just not as many pennies to be made.
Yeah, fascinating. And what does that consequentially mean? You know, a traditional power trader, traditional power trading desk, does that ultimately mean that there's, I don't know, same opportunity because you've got that combining of kind of volatility drivers and volatility suppressants? Is it just going to change the way the markets trade, or is it fundamentally going to sort of remove or ameliorate those sort of periods of outsized return when events happen?
If I knew the answer to that with any certainty, I'd probably be on a beach in South France, something like that. But I think what happens is it sort of changes volatility in quote normal market times. I think you're still going to have weather events and fear driven pricing events and sort of that human element that causes crazy price movements no matter what assets you have online. But I think in sort of the milder periods where there's not specifically any reason for volatility, batteries will end up absorbing a lot of that and compressing spreads that traders might have otherwise been able to capitalize on.
Europe is quite often seen, I think, is sort of the vanguard of this electrification and the renewables revolution, and even just on my friends' threads, chats back in Europe, they're talking about their battery today and how much they saved and so forth. So are we going to see in the US as well the sort of proliferation of batteries in the home, and what might that mean? And is there any sense you have of contrasting where the US is against, say, Europe in the prevalence of batteries? And is there anything that we can learn from what's happening there and apply it here? Or because we're in a completely different regulatory system, energy system, different, etc., that's hard to do?
I think it's more of the latter. I think, the Europe is absolutely always years ahead of the US in terms of adoption and sort of the advancement of these sorts of things. But I think in a lot of cases, the US never catches up because the regulatory regimes are so different. We see that a lot without sort of digressing too much, like with hydrogen, right? And sort of how those markets have differed across Europe and the US because the incentives are set up differently. And so it really causes a market difference in terms of if a product is even viable or not. So the US for batteries in the homes, we have in some cases no incentives for that. And it makes the economic decision completely different than in Europe. So I think, I would like to say that we'll get there one day. I'm just not sure we actually will.
Yeah, it actually comes down to that demand metering and all the rest of it.
Yes.
I mean, it's been absolutely fascinating, and I think it's a story we could go on for another hour on, because I think it is sort of one of these rapid changes that, frankly, as you sort of point out, has kind of been done largely, or in many cases, in the absence of regulatory and sort of the incentive schemes that have happened in Europe, and in the absence of sort of that consumer demand monitoring. Can you just, before you go, can you give us some sense of Caerus Commodities and actually what you guys are doing in this space? I think you've already alluded to why there's a differentiation point, but give us some sense of the trajectory you're on.
Sure. So, we founded Caerus about 4 years ago, specifically because we were so excited about the volatility that we saw coming in power markets as a result of sort of the broader energy transition. And we decided to capitalize on that in sort of these two different ways. One is the hedge fund that obviously just trades proprietary speculative positions financially across markets. And the other way is sort of this third party battery storage optimization, which we created because we feel like storage is a trading asset. And ultimately, we didn't see anyone else out there who was taking that same approach at sort of that center of my Venn diagram that I was talking about. And, I mentioned that in the beginning, we had underestimated how complex it was and how difficult it was. And all of that is true, but it's made it a very fascinating problem to solve and something that's been really rewarding for us along the way. We've been able to grow the team and the company to the point where we're now managing several gigawatts across various ISOs. And the algos and trading schemes created by our team have been ranked as number one across various markets by third party consultants, so people not related to Caerus. So that's been gratifying for us to really see that how we're doing things is working. And, we're excited to try and help more people get the most they can out of their storage, especially as that becomes more and more important.
Yeah, fabulous. Well, I'll put links to Caerus in the show notes so people can find you. And yeah, Casey, hopefully we can have you back on in a year and see where this story at, because I think we've all got a sense of how rapidly it's evolving and is a key driver of change in power markets globally.
Yeah, at that point, I'll probably be trying to raise money for a distressed battery fund. So happy to come back and talk about that.
Okay, good stuff.
Thanks, Paul.
Thank you for listening. To find out more about HC Group, our global offices, and our expertise in search within the commodities sector, please visit www.hcgroup.global.